I'm Bob from Hauptwerk Hardware, and welcome to this, the second video in our little series about electrifying a wooden tracker action keyboard so that we can use it in a Hauptwerk or other virtual organ setup. In part 1 we fitted the thumb pistons, and in this part we're going to be looking at how to use these little contacts and these little wipers so that whenever a key is pressed it can send a signal to our MIDI encoder. The idea is that the wiper is fitted to the key, and when you press the front of the key down, this part will go up and it will just rub against the contacts on this little switch and thereby connect them together. And what's clever about it, and the reason that we want to go for these over any other system, is because as it moves it actually causes the contacts to be kind of wiped by this, and it's a self-cleaning arrangement. So every time you press a key, because it slides along the bottom of the contacts, it actually helps to keep them clean. So these are Kimber Allen CAL4 contacts. They're the silver ones. You can get gold ones, but they're considerably more expensive. And these are the little Kimber Allen wipers that go with them. These are available separately, and the idea is each key has one of these fitted, and we have a bunch of these along the back of the keyboard, which obviously are contacted by the keys. So let's take a look at how we're going to do that with this particular keyboard. Okay, so here's our keyboard. I've installed a single key just so that we can see what we're going to do and how it's going to work. So the first thing is that we're going to install a piece of wood basically along the back of the whole keyboard, something like that, and then on top of the piece of wood we're going to mount our switches. And obviously there'll be one switch per key, so there'll be 61 switches, and then on each key we're going to mount our little metal wiper. So the first thing to do is to mount all of the wipers to the keys, and then after we've done that we need to prepare this piece of wood so that it's exactly the right length, fix it to the back of the keyboard, and then attach the switches so that they line up with all of the keys. Okay, so here's our wooden key, but there are one or two issues that we need to overcome in order to be able to fit these wipers to these keys. So if I zoom in a little bit so that we can actually get a good view of it. Okay, basically the biggest problem is that we've got this screw here which is used to adjust the level of the keys to make sure that they all sit in line at the front, and that's got a small cutout in the top of the screw, as you'd expect, but because it stands up proud of the key, when we put our wiper on there like that, it fouls the wiper. So what will happen if we do that is that as you play the keys you'll get a ticking noise as this comes down and taps onto each of those, which is not ideal. So what we need to do is to actually cut this screw off level with the top of the key, and then cut a new slot in the screw so that we can still adjust it up and down, but it's not protruding from the top of the key. So what I'm going to do is I'm basically unscrew it by 2 turns, which will lift it up. I'll then cut it off with a Dremel tool and cut a new slot into it, and then screw it back down by 2 turns so that it's level with the top of the key. And the idea of unscrewing it by a couple of turns is so that the actual Dremel cutter doesn't damage the top surface of the key. It probably wouldn't matter if it did contact it, if it did damage it, but because they're old and original, I just want to keep them in as nice a condition as possible. So that's the plan, and the first thing we need to do is to unscrew this little screw here so that we can move this spring out the way. Then we'll cut off the this adjustment screw, and then we'll mount the little wiper onto the key. So that's the sequence of operation, as it were. Okay, so I've got my little rotary tool here. Probably shouldn't keep calling it a Dremel because that's a trade name and this isn't. I think it came from Maplins or somewhere, but this is what we're going to use to cut these screws down. And I've got my little box of cutting discs here, which I got from somewhere off the internet, but basically they're just like a kind of fibre based cutting disc. They wear down really quickly. It'll take at least 2 of these to do all of these on one keyboard, but I've got some, actually got some of these little diamond ones as well, which don't work on the metal, so they're probably for something, but I'm not certain what. They certainly don't work on brass, but I've got plenty of these little cutting discs. They're very, very thin. They're only about 3/4 of a millimetre, maybe 1/2 a millimetre thick, and they're about 23 millimetres diameter, something like that. And they just screw onto the arbor, and we pop that in the end of the rotary tool. So let's get going and see how it goes. I'll just do them up finger tight. There is a spanner arrangement, but we're not going to be putting them under very much load, so that shouldn't be an issue. So first of all, loosen this screw and move this spring round out of the way, and then we'll just make a little mark on this, and then I'm going to unscrew it by 2 turns, cut it off where my mark is, put a new slot in it, and then screw it down again. Okay, so that's 2 turns. So hopefully you can see that I've just cut that down, put a new slot in the top, and now I'm going to screw it back down by 2 turns so that it becomes level with the top of the key. So now we can go ahead and fit our wiper without any problems or anything touching it. So what I've done on my little square here, I've marked, I don't know if you can see the marks, it's hard to see them actually because they're just in biro, but I've made a mark where each of the holes lines up on our contact, or our wiper rather. So I'm just going to project these across onto the key so I know where to drill the holes for the screws. So simply put that on there like that, and then just mark across from the square, and then using the square I can project those lines right across the key, which you're probably going to have problems seeing because my hand's in the way, sorry about that, but I'm just putting that across like that, and then we can just project the lines across so that we know where we've got to drill. And then we just need to lay our wiper in place so that we can find the centre of the holes. So I've just marked where the centre of that hole is, and then again I shall just project that line up through all of our lines, and now all I need to do is drill 3 holes. Now the first 2 are just at 90 degrees, that's for the first 2 screws that hold it down, but as you can see this is at an angle, the second part of the key, and the idea of the 3rd screw is that you can compress that up or down to adjust the point at which the contacts are operated when you press the key. So what that means is effectively the screw or the hole that's going through that 3rd one needs to be at an angle to the whole thing like that, and it's about sort of, I don't know, 40 degrees, something like that. So I'm going to drill 2 vertical or perpendicular holes and 1 at an angle, and then we pop in 2 3/8 by 3 brass screws into the holes that hold it down, and then our 3/8 by 1/2 inch screw into the one that's at an angle. Okay, so I've got my drill. I've installed a 2mm drill bit into the chuck, and that's the best size for these screws. They're number 3 by 3/8, so the 2mm drill bit seems to work very well. So I'm just going to drill the holes that we marked. So there's 2 perpendicular and one, I don't know if you can see that, if I do it from this angle I might see better, at about 40 degrees. Then get our contact and we just screw that in with 2 screws. These are the shorter ones, the 3/8 inch screws. So that's attached now quite nicely. We can see that there's not going to be any problem with it touching that screw. Then we take the 1/2 inch screw and we pop it through the angled hole. And we just screw that down until it just touches the key. So there we go, that's the 3rd one, and as you can see it's just touching the back there, so it's just starting. If I adjust that here, you can probably see it's just starting to move that contact down. So having done that, that's work complete for that key. We can put our little spring back in its correct position and tighten its screw down again, and then that's it. That's the first key done. 60 more to do. Okay, so I've completed all the keys now. Everything's ready, so I've put most of them back into the keyboard, so it's just the last couple to do. So we just pop those back in and hook them down with their springs to hold them in. And the last one. So happy days, all the keys are back in. Now the next thing we need to do is that these little hooks that hold these springs, and the actual springs themselves are actually so long that they touch the contacts when you press the key down to its fullest extent. So we need to look at adjusting these, i.e. cutting a bit off, so that the mechanism still works but nothing touches anything else. So we'll look at that next. Okay, so as I just mentioned, we've got a problem. When you press the key down, you can probably see that the brass screw is just contacting that little retainer which holds the spring down. So what we need to do is to just get some wire cutters and carefully lining it up as correctly as we can. Right, so if we cut that there, then it will no longer contact the spring or the screw, but it's folded across far enough and it goes down far enough that our retaining spring for that key is not going to come out. So we just cut that off like that, and then that solves the problem of the screw hitting that. However, there is another problem now, and that is that the actual spring itself is so long that it's making the contact bend down when it contacts it. So I don't know if you can see that, try and get in from that angle, but that contacts the spring, and then the last bit of movement makes the actual contact here. This is bending down as the spring hits it. So we need to fix that as well. So the answer to that is that we actually cut the spring a little bit shorter. So we'll do that as well whilst we're here, just like that. And now you can probably hear it sounds better anyway. You can hear the metal hitting on that one, but on the one we've done, that's nice and quiet and everything is as it should be. So we need to do that to all of the keys, and basically make sure that nothing's touching anything else, and then once we've done that we can get on and look at fitting the contacts. I've finished adjusting all of these clips and springs at the back now, so everything sounds nice and wooden again as it's supposed to. So our next thing now is that we need to fit these little switches, which is kind of quite hard to see. but these are going to be fitted along the back of the keyboard, and there'll be one for each key, and the idea is that the metal wiper that we fitted to the keys will come up and it will just touch these like that, and by doing so what's actually happening is that it's, because it contacts all four, it's effectively causing an electrical short between all four of these wires, so we need to fit these along the back. So what I've done, I've got this piece of wood which I've had machined to exactly the right size, the right kind of height if you like, so that when we fit it to the back of this keyboard it will hold the switches in the right place. So it's too long at the moment obviously, but if we put that in there like that, when we put a switch, just sitting the switch on top of it, then that's at exactly the right height that when I press the key you can just see it's touching the switch and moving it. So what we need to do is cut this piece of wood down to the right length, and then we need to look at drilling the wood and screwing it to the back of the keyboard and keeping everything in its right place. So that's what we're going to do next. So I shall go and cut the wood to the right length, and then we'll fit it to the keyboard, and then we'll fit the switches to the piece of wood. Okay, so I've marked the wood where I'm going to cut it, so I'm going to take this end off here with one line there, and then there's another line here. So get it positioned in our saw, make sure it's held down nice and tightly, get the position just right. So I'm just going to go right in the centre of the line. Normally I'd leave the line on, but I want this to be slightly inboard of the edges of the actual keyboard, so that should be about right, just where I am there. So we'll cut it off. And then the same at this end as well. So there we have our piece of wood, hopefully the right length. Okay, so I've turned our keyboard around now so that the rear is towards me, and got our piece of wood cut to length, so that's nice on there, and there's just, it's very slightly about 1.5 millimeters in from either end. So I'm just going to get a little piece of sandpaper and just clean these edges up from where I cut it, and then I'm going to drill 2 holes in this end and 2 holes in this end right through the piece of wood, and just spot into the back of the actual keyboard itself, into the end cheeks, and then I shall just pop a couple of screws through on either side just to hold the whole thing together, so then this becomes part of the keyboard and it'll be all ready to pop our switches on. So that's the next thing to do, is just drill, well, sandpaper it and mark these holes and drill them. Okay, so that's just cleaned up the end of our wood. I've done that for both ends, and what I've also done, I don't know if you can see that here in the camera, but I have marked a line down which marks where the end of this is, and I've just marked 2 little centres where I'm going to drill the holes. So we do that to both ends, and then we're ready to go. Okay, so that's our holes drilled. Next thing to do is to get a little countersink bit and just countersink the, getting them into the picture would help, wouldn't it, Jay? Just countersink the tops of the holes, and also just give the bottom of it a little bit of a rub again, just to get rid of where the drill's broken through. And then we can pop it onto the back of the keyboard there. So, countersink bit next then, and just do those holes with that. Okay, so I've fitted a countersink bit to the drill now, so I'm just going to countersink the tops of these holes. And then a bit of a hoover up in a moment, and then we're all ready to pop that onto the back there with the screws, and then we can fit the switches. What I've done now, I want to screw into this end of the keyboard. I haven't drilled pilot holes into the end cheeks here, but this is drilled through, as you saw just now, and countersunk. So I want to be able to put some pressure on it when I'm drilling into it. So what I've done is I've put a piece of wood at the back here between the keyboard and the wall, just so that I can get a good press on the front of that and nothing's going to move out the way. So I'll pop the two screws in this end, and then we'll move our piece of wood to the other end of the keyboard, and I'll pop the two screws in the other end. So that's the next thing to do. So they go in nicely, and then the same at this end. So we just move our piece of wood and that's it really. The reason that I use this piece of wood rather than standing the thing up on its end, which I could have done, because then obviously I'd just be pushing down onto the bench and that would have been fine, but by doing it this way it means it's on a level surface, and this piece of wood is also on the same surface, so everything's going to line up perfectly underneath, and that's why I chose to do it that way. So all we've got to do now is fix all of our switches on there like that, or our contacts, and we'll look at doing that now. It's time to fit our contacts to the keyboards now, and these are the contacts that we're going to be using. They are Kimber Allen is the manufacturer, and they are CAL4 is the model number, and it has the number 4 in the model number because there are 4 pieces of wire coming out of the thing. And what we're going to do when we connect this up is that we're going to use 2 of them to connect as one side of the switch, if you like, and the other 2 as the other side of the switch. And the way that we're going to do this, the way that it's going to work, is that if we fit these to our piece of wood here, they will overlap, the wires will overlap the wipers on the keys here, so that when you operate a key, if I hold that down, you'll see that the wiper of the key comes up and it touches the bottom of those 4 pieces of wire, and it effectively, because it's a metal wiper, it causes an electrical short between all 4 of those pieces of wire. So that's primarily what's happening, but there's a secondary benefit to this as well, because if you look closely, what you'll see is that where it touches the wire there, as it goes further, the wire bends and it actually slides along the wire. So you can see it's wiping along the bottom of the wire, which I guess is why they call it a wiper. But what that does is it helps to keep the wire clean. So these contacts are effectively self-cleaning. So what we've got to do is to fit one of these sets of contacts to each key on our keyboard here. And there are various ways that I've seen these fitted. The Kimber Allen ones have this cutout in the back here, so you could put a whole load of them in a line, and then you could fit into that like a square piece of wood or metal or something, which is bolted down along the length of the wood. I've only ever actually seen that done on one organ, which was very, very old, and generally speaking they're just glued on. So that's the approach that I'm going to use today. I'm just going to glue the switches down, and I'm going to use this hot melt glue, just ordinary hot melt glue. I've used it before on lots of keyboards, never had a problem with it, so it's just the easiest way to go. And our piece of wood here and the distance between it works out that if we line up the front of this contact with the front of our piece of wood, just roughly, it doesn't have to be exact, but somewhere around there, then it's always going to be in the right place. It doesn't matter if some are further forward or further back than others, as long as they're all roughly the same, and as long as these wipers will touch them in the right place. So here we go. Let's pop some glue onto the bottom of the switch, just like that, and then we put the switch nice and square and in line with the key, and just hold it down until that glue sets. And that is pretty much it. So that will now work as we require. So that's all we need to do. We're just going to work our way along, and then when we've done that with all of the keys, we will adjust the point at which they operate. So the idea of putting this screw in when we were fitting the wipers to the keys is that as we screw this down, you'll notice that it increases the gap between the wiper and the contact, which means that you have to push the key down further before it touches. And likewise, if we release the screw slightly, it brings it closer to this, which means we don't have to push the key down as far. So our goal at the end of it is to get them all adjusted equally, so that all of the keys operate the contacts at the same point where they're pressed down. So what I'm going to do now is go ahead and fit all of the switches, or contacts if you will, to all of the keys along here, and we'll come back and look at it when that's done. I've got all the contacts fitted now. They're all glued, and they're very firm on this piece of wood, so they're definitely not going anywhere, and obviously all work as expected. So I'm just going to run along with the screwdriver quickly now, and just adjust these third screws here, those screws there, so that we get the adjustment point the same on all of the keys. I've adjusted all of the wipers now to the correct height, so that all the keys play at pretty much the same point, as they should do. So that's more or less it for this video. We've covered fitting all of the keys. We've covered the thumb pistons in the previous video. Now the last video, the third video, will be on how we wire all this up and how we make it work. And basically what we're going to do is we're going to use one of these connection strips, which will be bolted to the back of this piece of wood, and then all of these contacts will have wires coming back to this for the keys. And then for the thumb pistons, we'll use this smaller board, which will be screwed to the wood as well, further up there, and the thumb piston wires will come and connect to that. So that's all going to be in part 3, which will be coming shortly. Also in part 3, we're going to show you how to route out the bottom of the keyboard to be able to accommodate the wires from the thumb pistons. So if we turn this up on end, you can see that we've got our thumb pistons there, but there's the solid piece of wood behind, so we have to route a slot through this so that we can get our wires through to the back to connect to the small circuit board that I was showing you just now. So that's all going to be in part 3, and I'll see you then, and thanks for watching.